tell you folks who weren't in choir practice, just be here Sunday, okay? Just be amazed. Yeah, I mean, we're setting the bar, ladies, pretty high, okay? Just so you'll know. We're going to sing tonight number 450 and number 451. If you're in the hymn book, I Need Thee Every Hour is number 450, and Tell It to Jesus is number 451. We're going to sing the first and last stanzas of both, and we would ask that you stand and sing and worship with us. Join us now for our fellowship time and welcoming.
of the 12, looking at the 12 apostles or the 12 disciples, as we sometimes are mentioning them as. And so I'm going to ask you to turn in your Bible with me to, first off, to Luke chapter 9. And that's where we're going to look at, but it's going to be a little bit before we get there, but I want you to be in Luke chapter 9. We're going to be looking at verses 51 through 56 tonight. And we'll be there in just a few moments. Now, we've already started this series. We talked about just the calling of the 12. We talked a little bit about what was, how they were ordinary men that the Lord did extraordinary things through. And then last time that we were together, 2 weeks ago, we talked about, we looked at Peter, Simon Peter, and we talked about his life and his death and the lessons that we can learn from him. And that's what we're going to do tonight, looking at James the Greater, or James the brother of John. And so he's the headstrong son of thunder, as Jesus referred to him. But I'm going to read to you again an excerpt from John MacArthur's 12 Ordinary Men, which is a great book that dives into the apostles or the disciples more than I can in our short time together each evening. And so I would encourage you, it's a great read. But it says this about James, who he calls the apostle of passion. It says, James is the prototype of the passionate, zealous front-runner who is dynamic, strong, and ambitious. Ultimately, his passions were tempered by sensitivity and grace. Somewhere along the line, he had learned to control his anger, bridle his tongue, redirect his zeal, eliminate his thirst for revenge, and completely lose his selfish ambition. And the Lord used him to do a wonderful work in the early church. And so, we get a real picture of who James would have been in what little we learn about him in the Bible. And so, as with each of the disciples, we're going to start off by looking at his bio and see what we know about him. As you heard me say, referred to him as James the Greater. He was called James, or James the Great, or the Greater. And it's probably, there is some thought that the reason he's called James the Greater is because there is James the Lesser, who is another disciple, but that may have to do with stature and height more than anything. There's no real knowledge as to why he was called James the Greater, but that is most likely the case. We don't know when he was born, but we know where he was born, and that is in Bethsaida of Galilee, which is on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee near Capernaum. We know when he died because of the rulers in place in the biblical record. We know he died in the year AD 44. We know that he died in Jerusalem, and we know that his profession up until he was called to be a disciple and follower of Christ was that he was a commercial fisherman like Simon, Peter, and Andrew, and alongside not only his brother John, but with his father Zebedee. And we know that he was first mentioned in Matthew chapter 4, verse 21, when we have this listing of the disciples, the 12, when they're first listed there. And as far as we know, there were no writings. That was something that sort of came along a little later after he lost his life. And so when we look at James's life, when we look at the life that he lived, that we really only know a few things about him. But there just isn't much written about him. But there are 6 things that we can identify him by. There are 6 things that we really know about him, but beyond that, there's not a whole lot. The first one is that we know that he is known for being the brother of John. John the Apostle, John that wrote the Gospel, the Epistles, and the book of Revelation, the patriarch of the Ephesian church for a long time, the one who was dipped in boiling oil before being sent to the island of Patmos. That was his brother John. That was James's brother. It's believed, though, that James was older than John simply because he is always listed first. It was sort of this patriarchal, society, and so they generally listed the older brother first. And so we believe that Peter was older than Andrew as well. But nevertheless, we know that John is oftentimes referred to as the brother of James. And so we see that in Matthew and Mark in their Gospels. But he's always listed in reference to his brother. There's always this connection between James and John. And interestingly enough, James's name is nowhere mentioned in John's Gospel. Now, is that just a dig at your brother because, he was mean to you when you were a kid? Or was it maybe that even 50 years after the martyr of his brother, John still was struggling with his brother's death? That may very well be the case. We don't know. But James's name is nowhere mentioned in his brother's gospel. The second thing we know about him is that he is known for being in the inner three, that inner circle of Jesus's his close friends there. James was one of those three in Jesus' inner circle alongside of Peter and John. It seemed like when something was happening and three of the disciples were there, Peter, James, and John were there. Peter, James, and John were here and there and yon. And so out of the three men who were closest to Jesus, James is actually the one we know the least about. He's the one that we don't really have a whole lot of information about. He was called to be an apostle at the same time his brother John was. They were fishing, and they left to follow Jesus with Peter and Andrew. But we know that was his calling. Now, they were present, as being part of this inner circle of Jesus's. We know that they were present when there were events that went on that some of the other disciples weren't a part of. We know that they witnessed in what we read in Mark chapter 5 and Luke chapter 8. We read about how they witnessed the resurrection of Jairus' daughter. They also witnessed on the Mount of Transfiguration Jesus' conversation with Elijah and Moses. And they also questioned Jesus privately. It was the four of them together, the three of them and Jesus, and they're questioning him privately in Mark chapter 13 about the end times. They're asking him, about the signs and things that would go on. But they were also the closest three to Jesus when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he was praying that, this cup would pass from him. And so the third thing that we know about John is his nickname, the nickname that Jesus gave him. And I'm going to try and pronounce this. Boanerges is the way that is supposed to be pronounced. Boanerges. Which means son of thunder. Him and his brother John were given this sons of thunder moniker because of their sort of their passionate, zealous attitude. Probably had that kind of just that kind of a personality. But he gave that name to them, that name that means sons of thunder. And so could you imagine sitting in a deacon's meeting with some guys named, the sons of thunder? I mean, you imagine what kind of stuff you'd get done or not get done because of them? I mean, that's sort of the personality that comes along. And it's kind of interesting, and we'll see this with John, is that John goes from being the son of thunder, which, just gives this, this image to us, to being this saintly, elderly patriarch of the church that is just sort of not timid, but is just, sort of a watered-down version, a calmed-down version may be a better way of himself. And James, as we know, never has an opportunity to get to that point. But we know also, the fourth thing is that he's known for wanting to destroy a Samaritan village. James and his brother John talked with Jesus about calling down fire from heaven to destroy a Samaritan village that had rejected Jesus, that had not offered him any help. And so James or John are like, let's just smite them, Lord. Let's call down fire from heaven and just be done with them. And, as we know, the Samaritans and the Jews didn't get along very well, and James and John took it to the extreme there. But nevertheless, we know the fifth thing about him is that he's known for asking for a position of power. The mother of James and John, Salome, if I'm not mistaken, was prompted by them to ask for places of power beside Jesus in the coming kingdom. And we read about that in Matthew chapter 20 and Mark chapter 10. So they're talking with mom, and they're like, "Hey, mom, can you talk to to Jesus and get him to give us these positions of power?" I mean, think about that. We're the sons of thunder. We'll be up there beside Jesus, and we'll be doing all this great stuff in the kingdom. It's sort of that mentality that they had. But finally, we know the sixth thing that we know about him is that he was known for his death. And that's unfortunate in a lot of ways, but we know nothing about the ministry of James in the 10+ years between Jesus' death on the cross and resurrection and ascension and James's death. There's about 10 to 11 years there, as we said, AD 44, so it was maybe 10 to 15 years there that he was alive after Jesus' death. But James was present when Jesus appeared as the resurrected Lord, as we read about in John 21. James was present for that. There is a claim that James preached the gospel in Spain during that time period, but we don't have any real proof or record of that. It's more a tradition from church history. That he left Jerusalem, preached in Spain, and then came back to Jerusalem before his death. And so, and that's sort of where we're going to sort of transition to is James's death, because James was the first apostle to be martyred for his faith in Christ. He was the very first one to die, and he is also the only apostle whose death is recorded in the scriptures for us. And it says there in Acts 12, verses 1 and 2, it says, "It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword." And so Herod Agrippa I, which was the grandson of Herod the Great, the one who tried to eliminate Jesus after talking to the Magi, had the massacre of the innocents, had the 2-year-old boys killed in Bethlehem. That was his grandson who had some Christians arrested so that he could persecute them, and he did so in an effort to increase his popularity with the Jews. The Jews were subjects of Rome, but they held a lot of sway and a lot of power in Jerusalem and in Judea. And because of the power that they held, they could influence things with the Roman government, and they could make things difficult for these puppet leaders like Herod, who, even though he was called King Herod Agrippa, he wasn't really a king. He was actually an Idumean, which means that he was from Esau's line, not from Jacob's line. And so what that means is he's not even a real king in Israel, but he took the title because Rome gave it to him. And so trying to hold on to that power and continue the line of the Herods, as he had been a part of, he was trying to do things to keep the Jews happy. So what better way to keep the Jews happy than to persecute some of this sect of the Jewish faith, as they saw it, the Christians? Well, we'll persecute them, and it will make the Jews happy. And so among those that were arrested and persecuted was James, the brother of John. And in Acts chapter 12, verse 2 there, it tells us that James was put to death with the sword, which means that he was beheaded. And so he was beheaded just like John the Baptist. Now, this is kind of interesting. One of the early church fathers, a man by the name of Clement of Alexandria, said that when James went on trial for his life, his steadfast testimony led to the conversion of his accuser, who was carried off with him to execution. And so James, in knowing that his time was done, knowing that there was no hope of getting out of this situation, he held fast to his faith. He was again that son of thunder there, presenting a very powerful presentation of the gospel and sticking to his testimony about who Jesus was. And because of that, the man who had accused him to get him into the place that Herod could persecute him was converted by that and then executed with him. And so, we look at that, and as I said last time, we don't want to end on the negative aspects of these men's lives. And so we're going to look at the lessons that are learned from James. And the first one that we see from James, really this is the main one that we see from him, is that passion must be focused. Excuse me. From what we read of him, it's pretty clear that James was just a very passionate and zealous man, that he was passionate for the work of the kingdom, and you wouldn't receive a nickname like the Son of Thunder if you didn't have a thunderous personality, a very outspoken personality, just this bigger than life type of personality. And so, when we think about it, there isn't anything wrong with being passionate like that, as long as that passion is focused in the right direction. Think about some other passionate people that we read about in the Scriptures. You read about Elijah, you read about Nehemiah, and even John the Baptist, and they all had this bigger-than-life, passionate, sort of thundering personality. And James was probably this intense, outspoken, and zealous guy. And his personality would have made him a perfect candidate to be the leader of the apostles. But with Peter taking the lead role, then James, usually being listed after Peter as sort of the second apostle, gives us the indication that we could probably imagine he was a good second in command. He was the vice chair of the apostles, if you want to call it that. But he was that second leader that Jesus could rely on and would support Peter in his primary role as the leader of the apostles. Now, we learn this lesson of passion needing to be focused from the two main events that are recorded in the Gospels that reference James. And the main reason our passion for Christ and His kingdom must be focused is, as we see in James's life, it can be deadly if it's not. If that passion is not focused correctly, it can be detrimental. And so John MacArthur, in that book that I referenced earlier, says this: whenever zeal disintegrates into uncontrolled passion, it can be deadly. And as we see with the life of James, the zeal and uncontrolled passion that he had the opportunity to be deadly. So I asked you to look at, or turn to Luke chapter 9, verses 51 through 56 is where we're going to look at. And this is where James and John are offering to help Jesus wipe out a Samaritan village. And so it says, beginning in Luke chapter 9, verse 51, it says this: as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him, because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them, and they went to another village. And so what we see here is that, the Jews had this real hatred for the Samaritans. They considered the Samaritans to be a half-breed. They weren't pure Israelites like them, because the Assyrians had assimilated into the northern kingdom of Israel when they conquered them, not long after the time of Jonah that we're talking about on Sunday mornings. And so because of that, there was a real intermarriage with the Canaanites and with the Assyrians. And so what we see is that the Samaritans were not, if you want to call them pure-blooded or pure Jews, and the Jews saw that, and they held that against the Samaritans. They just hated the Samaritans, their neighbors to the north, their cousins, so to speak. But the Samaritans didn't have any love for the Jews either. They absolutely hated the Jews. And with Jesus headed to Jerusalem from Galilee, because you've got Galilee in the north, You've got Jerusalem in the south, and between that is the region of Samaria that you have to go through. Or you go a longer way and go around Samaria to get to Jerusalem. And so Jesus is like, I'm headed to Jerusalem, and we're just going to go straight as a crow flies, and we're going to head straight through Samaria. And so as they're going through there is this one village that they wanted to have accommodations in. They wanted to stay the night. And in the Middle East, even today, hospitality is a big thing. It's huge in Jesus' day. A lot of that is shown to us through his parables and the things that he teaches about and just the way he interacts with people. But the Samaritans are like, no, you're a Jew, you're going to Jerusalem, you're getting no help. You're not welcome here. They put up the no vacancy sign and said, find somewhere else, so to speak. And so with Jesus headed to Jerusalem for the Passover, the Samaritans made it hard on him and his crowd to find food and accommodations. And so, the interesting thing about that is that Jesus always treated the Samaritans with kindness and compassion. Think about this. He healed a Samaritan leper. He led the woman at the well to faith. And not only that, he also made a Samaritan the hero of one of his most well-known parables of all time, the Good Samaritan. And so the disrespect to Jesus by the Samaritans didn't sit well with, obviously, any of his disciples, but the sons of thunder, being that passionate and boisterous and just, over-the-top type of personalities, they weren't going to stand for this kind of disrespect towards Jesus. And so James and John were outraged at that contempt that was shown towards Jesus, and they asked Jesus about calling down fire from heaven, just like Elijah did in the same area about 900 years before. And so what we see is that Jesus rebukes them, and he gives them an important answer as to why he wouldn't allow it, why he wouldn't even be a part of it. And it says, but he turned and rebuked them. This is what it says in verses 55 and 56. It says, you do not know let me make sure I read that right. You do not know what manner of spirit you are of, for the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them, and they went to another village. And so when we read that, we realize that, Jesus is saying, you don't know what you're asking. You don't know what you're doing here. And Jesus' compassion for the Samaritans in that village helped eventually to lead some of them to faith in him. Now you're thinking, no, wait a minute, how is that possible? Jesus was basically told, you can't come in here. You can't come into this village. You can't stay here. You can't get food here. How is that helping Jesus lead them to faith? Well, the interesting thing is, and we'll learn about this apostle a little bit later, but in Acts chapter 8, we're told how the apostle Philip preached the gospel in Samaria, and multitudes, not one or two, but multitudes were saved. Multitudes of Samaritans came to faith in Christ because of the work of the apostle Philip. And had Jesus allowed in the rejection and the disrespect that he received from the Samaritans, had he allowed James and John to call down fire on that village, some of those would not have had an opportunity to hear the gospel from the apostle Philip years later. And so thankfully, the passion and zeal that the sons of thunder showed for destroying that Samaritan village was restrained by Christ. Now, I want you to turn with me over to Matthew chapter 20, and this is the last place that we're going to look at tonight. But we're going to look at Matthew chapter 20, and it's going to be verses 20 through 24. And what we're looking at here is where where James and John's mother is asking for them to have thrones in the coming kingdom. And so in Matthew chapter 20, and in verse 20, it says this. It says, then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, kneeling down, asked a favor of him. What is it you want? He asked. She said, grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. And Jesus said, "You don't know what you are asking. Can you drink the cup I am going to drink?" They said, "We can." And Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father." When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. And so, James and John have basically put their mother up to asking for a favor, asking for a position of power. And they want this position in the coming kingdom with Christ. Because you got to remember, they're still under the impression that Jesus' kingdom and his work as the Messiah delivering Israel is going to be a physical earthly kingdom that will get rid of the Romans and reestablish Israel as their own kingdom. And so they're thinking, man, Jesus is going to do his thing as the Messiah, and we're going to, it's just going to be great in Israel. And hey, if me and my brother are sitting on either side of Jesus, this is going to be really good. And so James and John are talking to their mother, and they end up asking Jesus to do this. And Jesus rebukes them for doing this. He asks them if they can drink from the same cup and be baptized with the same baptism as him. And Jesus is he's trying to show them a very important thing, and that is that suffering comes before glory. And both men, in their attitudes and their sort of boisterous and zealous and passionate personalities, they both, without really thinking about it, answer, "Yeah, we can do that." "Yeah, oh yeah, we can do that, Jesus." Because they think that if they say, "Yes, we can do that," then Jesus will just hand over these positions to them, and then they're going to be like Jesus' right and left hand men when it comes to this new kingdom. But Jesus tells them that they will drink of the cup and be baptized like him. But what they didn't realize was that they had just volunteered for something that they had no way of fully comprehending. There was no way that they would understand what that meant for them. James had no idea that in less than 15 years he would be dead, beheaded because of his faith in Christ. And John had no way of knowing that he would outlive all of the other apostles, watching his friends and men he considered to be brothers to be persecuted and martyred and killed, some of them very horrifically, as we'll see throughout this series. But John had no idea the suffering that he would endure himself as he promises he can take what Jesus has to offer or what would happen to him. And so Jesus lets them know that the thrones that they want, they're not even his to give. And they're not necessarily part of the deal for them saying, "Yes, we can take what you have to give us, Jesus. Yes, we can drink from the cup. Yes, we can be baptized like you." And Jesus is like, "That's great, but guess what? The thrones aren't part of that deal. The thrones you're asking for, they're not even mine to give." And so eventually what we see is that their passion for power opened them up to the deaths that Jesus knew that they would experience. In that moment when Jesus is rebuking them, saying, you don't know what you're asking for. You're going to drink the same cup. You're going to be baptized the same way. Jesus, as we talked about in Sunday school this morning, as God, he knows what's coming. And he knows that these two men, the short life that James would live and the long life that John would live, and the emotional torture that they would go through because they had agreed to move forward in this way. And so their passion for positions of power also hurt their relationships with the other apostles, because the others were not happy when they heard what James and John were up to. The other 10, especially I'm sure that Peter was really set off by this, because, here Peter is, he's the leader of the apostles, and, James and John are, like second and third, and they're trying to get ahead of Peter, and Peter, well, wait a minute now, what are you doing? And, all of the apostles, the other 10 of them, were sort of feeling slighted because James and John were like, "Hey, Jesus, you can trust us to take those positions, and we'll do great by it, and we'll do a good job for you." And they're basically saying, we can do it, but these other guys can't. And so, from then on, what we see is that there were no other conversations amongst the disciples or the apostles about who deserved certain positions until their very last night with Jesus. And we read about that in Luke 22. And so, James would have been there, and you wonder if in that moment, when they're in the upper room and they're talking with Jesus about the things that would go on and, in the future, and even asking for these positions of power, you wonder if James and John had sort of tempered their personalities a little bit by that point, and they're like, "You guys can fight over them. We don't want in the mix," or did they still jump to the front of the line, wanting to try and be the ones that would get those positions? But nevertheless, that is our look at the Apostle James tonight. Next time we're together, we will look at the Apostle John, and then look at the Apostle Andrew after that. We'll do one a night for the next few weeks, and then eventually, because there is such limited information on some of them, we'll look at two a night. And so we'll talk about what we know about them, what we know about where they ministered. Thomas is said to have went to India. Andrew is said to have went to Armenia, I think it is. And so there's a lot to be learned about these guys. And so it's a very interesting series we've got ahead of us. Once we get done with looking at the apostles in a few weeks, what we will do then is we will transition into another book study, and we're going to start looking at the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. We're going to go from creation to the Tower of Babel, and so we'll be looking at some well-known stories such as the flood, the Tower of Babel, Cain and Abel, and some others. And so look forward to us diving into that and doing a book study on the first part of the book of Genesis. And so that's where we'll head on Sunday nights after we get through with this series. But nevertheless, we'll call it quits for tonight, and we will look to be here on Wednesday night. We'll be continuing in our series on restoration, and so hope that you'll be able to be a part of that. I want to ask Rob if he'll close us out with a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed.